Hey everyone, I'm John Negroni, film editor for theyoungfolks.com, and I'm also the host of the Cinemaholics podcast. Let's get into a new movie that is now available to watch in theaters from 20th Century Studios, The Last Duel. The Last Duel is the latest film from Ridley Scott. This is his first film in several years since releasing All the Money in the World and Alien Covenant back in 2017. He's actually back this year with two films. He has House of Gucci coming out, I think, next month, and The Last Duel, which is out right now, and it's a film that's very different from many of his previous epics. The marketing presents The Last Duel as a sweeping epic story, perhaps akin to Gladiator. If you've seen any of the trailers, I think it kind of tries to harken to Gladiator because it knows people love that movie. And I do think that Gladiator, at least for me, is Scott's best film in the last 20 years. It's one of his very best films. And elements of this movie, The Last Duel, certainly reminded me of how dedicated Ridley Scott is as a director when it comes to capturing historical time periods and all of their gritty details and all of their world building and lore and how he captures an entire setting. Even if they're not technically historically accurate in terms of the story and certain technical details in the setting, his movies tend to capture a very consistent spirit of the time period, I think, that makes the film engaging and authentic in its own way. But this new movie submits some especially challenging subject matter, some very modern, relevant subject matter, for sure, as its title refers to a true story and is based on Eric Jager's 2004 book of the same name. It's about the last legally sanctioned duel, or I guess we could say trial by combat if you've seen Game of Thrones. And this is the last legally sanctioned duel in France, which occurred in the late 12th century during the bubonic plague right before the Crusades. It's a time period for sure that was very desperate. There's a lot of desperation. There was a lot of hardship during this time. And the movie itself, though, mainly tracks a very small, intimate rivalry between two very different men, two men of very different means. One of them is a squire named Jean, who is set to inherit a captaincy. He's on his way to becoming a knight, and this man is played by Matt Damon. He sports a very ridiculous mullet that, in my opinion, honestly matches his very oafish tendencies. He has an on-again, off-again friendship with another squire, the more dashing and suave and handsome Jacques, played by Adam Driver, who he came from more humble origins. He kind of grew up with nothing, but he's nevertheless earned favor with the local nobility, and he's quickly climbing his way up the social hierarchy, much to Jean's displeasure. He feels in a way that that's not quite right, and he hasn't earned it, but Jean has. And at the true center of these bitter rivals is Marguerite, played by Jodie Comer, a young and beautiful woman who's handed off to be married to Jean, but is coveted by Jacques. The film plays out in a very similar structure to Rashomon, albeit with just three perspectives and without a neutral party in the background, like it doesn't open in the same way where it's a few people sitting around talking about what happened. Nothing like that. The movie actually starts with a part one, fixated around Jean's side of the story, Jean again being Matt Damon, which spans about 16 years or so. It tracks his friendship with Jacques, played by Adam Driver, and how things deteriorate between them. And I should say, technically, the movie starts with a part of the duel and then gets into part one. So I got to be accurate there. And yeah, so things deteriorate between them, and ultimately Jean demands justice for his wife, who tells him that Jacques has raped her. And this first part of the movie plays out in a very traditional way. His perspective is a movie we'd probably expect to see from Ridley Scott many years ago. In fact, it reminded me a lot of his version of Robin Hood, which he made about a decade ago, in fact, where heroes are heroes. And Matt Damon is a hero. Jean is a hero. He has to rise against all odds and injustice and this terrible thing that's happened. He has to protect the honor of his wife and his family's name. And you get it. I mean, it's a very traditional hero story. But there's obviously much more to this movie, to the real story. And that probably has a lot to do with the screenplay, which I believe was divided up between three writers. Matt Damon reportedly covered the first part, which has his character at the center, right? And then Ben Affleck covers part two, which details Jacques' perspective over the same period of time. So we literally go all the way back to the very beginning of this 16-year story, but we see it through Jacques, played by Adam Driver's story, his point of view. And where we saw Damon's part of the story about a valorous warrior constantly being victimized by very evil men who were just jealous of his accomplishments, Adam Driver is Jacques, a talented, roguish man who had to earn everything he's gained. He didn't just inherit it in the same way as Jean, though mostly what we see that he's gained is through a close friendship with the Count, played by Ben Affleck. Hence, I believe Ben Affleck wrote this part of the movie. And the Count sees Jacques as just a more fun person, a pleasant person to be around. There's a lot of partying that happens between them, and there's a lot in this movie with their relationship showing the way that men sort of like enable each other to do bad things. That's all I'll say about that. So you can see how these two men, Jean and Jacques, see themselves as the heroes of their own stories. Jacques commits the rape against Marguerite, but he painfully tries to justify his actions through the loose morals of a man in a Greek tragedy, because that's how he sees himself. He's not someone truly interested in absolution and forgiveness. And it's not until the film spins into the third perspective, the part 3 of the movie, which reportedly was written by Nicole Holofcener, where we actually see Marguerite's view of what happened, her point of view of these series of events. And I think it's at this point that The Last Duel finally feels like the real movie these actors wanted to make. That's not to say the first 2/3 are useless, like they don't do anything. No, they build up and contextualize what makes the third part so fascinating. Once you see these men's childish renditions of the story, it makes Jodie Comer's performance all the more profound when you compare them side by side. When you see things of how, when you see how Scott changes the framing of a certain scene to reveal what the text of the film goes out of its way to declare as the truth of what really happened, which is its biggest distinction from Rashomon, in which Kurosawa, he wanted that story to be vague. He wanted the idea of objective truth to not be known by the audience because that's how life really is. And this movie, I think, makes up for that in a way because it's doing its own thing, but it also has its own sort of tricks, its own sort of gimmicks in the way that in one version of the events, it's through the actual eyes of the person. So when you are on Jacques' side, you see Jodie Comer and her reactions, but his interpretation of her reaction to him. And then in the third part, you see him from her eyes. And that's when it becomes like a horror movie. And I think that's where this movie is at its best, when it's about perspective, when it's about the way that one person can be so imbalanced in a power dynamic like that, and the way that cinema and film can get that story across. It's very strong. And I do think, compared to, Kurosawa's Rashomon, Scott is instead saying that some perspectives do hold more weight than others. And I almost find this black and white morality to be a little bit self-defeating, like almost contradictory, because yes, you come out of this movie knowing exactly what you're supposed to feel, and it all rings quite true to me, and I'm sure many other people who are watching. But I struggle to see what is gained by the movie's execution of its message, or at least how it executes the message. It depicts, for example, the same scene of graphic sexual assault twice. And it ultimately is trying to get the point across, I think, that from the woman's perspective, it's even more indefensible. So it has to show both so you can see that. But ultimately, both are indefensible and horrific. And so I don't see how this film's handling of this issue gets us anything all that important. I didn't get anything new or helpful information from that. It only, by my estimation, guarantees extra traumatic distress by many women and men as well who've lived through acts like this. So I'm conflicted, because it's not as if the film constantly mishandles the subtlety and sensitivity around such a difficult problem that has persisted to this day in varying degrees. I think that the film doesn't try to go down the route of, look how far we've come as a society. It doesn't do like the Green Book thing, right? But instead, it makes clear that society, for all its progress, is still so far away from addressing the root issue, the root cause of why so many men feel entitled to mistreat women, to treat them like property, and how this sort of thing takes many forms. Obviously, what Jacques does is evil on its face. There's no arguing that. But the first section of the film is also fascinating in retrospect, because when we see his relationship with Marguerite through her eyes in the last part of the movie, there's way more nuance. You see the bitter misogyny beneath his self-believing facade of chivalry. He thinks he's a great man, but we see far too quickly how he puts himself and his interests and his pride well ahead of the woman he claims to love. How it's okay if what happens to her, well, gets him ahead. He's willing to do certain things at her expense. I'm still not completely sure where I stand with The Last Duel, and that's certainly a good sign. I appreciate the risks the film takes, even if I don't equally love all of them. The approach to the accents, for example, is far more distracting than it isn't. These are American actors. They're kind of doing a tinge of fake European voice, like not British, not French. It's almost like they're trying to develop like a new dialect, but it's very uneven, or it sounded uneven to me. It's all over the place. And there were times when I regressed into camp. Like I felt like I was watching something that was making fun of this situation, which was a little weird. And I get it. It's a hard problem to solve when a film takes place in France, and French accents can really be tricky. And I can understand why they did this the way that they did it. I couldn't help though but wonder how much more immersive this film might have been if it had been made with French actors. And that's not the same. I mean, the actors all do a fantastic job. I thought they did a great job. And otherwise, I didn't have any complaints with their performances. So it's not a major complaint. It doesn't ruin the film. But I do think that some people will find it easier to accept than others. So there's that. And I do have to mention the titular duel itself is also, in my opinion, worth the time it takes to actually get to it. I mean, this is a long movie. And I was definitely nervous about how Scott was building up to this fight, because along the way, it seems like he's proposing, and I think rightfully so, that the fight itself is extremely petty and unnecessary. It's worthy of scorn. We're not supposed to want this to happen. But then I was worried that the fight would happen and then it would revel in the visceral excitement of a bloody fight that gets people pumping their fists. And I think that would have betrayed the spirit of what the film's trying to say. Fortunately, I think that Scott did this correctly, or I shouldn't say correctly, but he does it in a way that I think matches what he's trying to say. Like, it's consistent. It has integrity, because the fight's hard to watch. It is gruesome. And most importantly, it's ugly. Not ugly from the way the director made it, but it's ugly to see these two pitiful men just hurting each other. Like, there's nothing exciting or fun about it. And I think that's the right way to do it. I think that that's a better way to tell this story all the way through, because at the same time, this fight has way more crucial stakes than I expected going in, where my heart was pounding the entire time. Not for these two men, but for the woman caught in such an impossible situation. The way this movie builds empathy for her is really impressive. So for that much, I can say that The Last Duel accomplishes quite a lot, even if it does force the audience to sit through some horrendous and definitely unnecessary trauma, at least I think, to get the whole picture of what it's trying to say. But there's so much good in this movie that I do think that once you weigh all of this, it should be easy for you to determine for yourself if it's worth checking out. So The Last Duel is now available to watch in theaters through 20th Century Studios. I imagine it will have quite a lot of awards consideration coming up this year. It had a strong showing at the Venice Film Festival. It's getting mostly good reviews from other critics. And if you decide to see it for yourself, I want to know whether or not you think the film properly handles its structuring of these difficult scenes I was talking about. Or if you have a different argument altogether, I want to hear it. So thank you for watching, of course, and I'll be having a longer conversation about this movie on the Cinemaholics podcast, hopefully this week. Keep an eye out for that if you aren't subscribed already. And I'll see you all in the comments. I don't know about the comics. If you're in comics, that's cool too. But I'll be checking out the comments if any of you have anything to say about this movie. I'm very curious to see how people are going to react to this. Box office-wise, The Last Duel is not making money. It had a very bad opening weekend. Might be worth having a conversation about that as well in the Cinemaholics podcast. If you want my thoughts on that, I will be talking about it there. So for now, I will see you all next time.